afternoon. Should I wait for them to just go? Okay. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johnny. So I'm going to talk a bit about VPN and the risks and things like that. So let me get started. So this is the agenda today. We'll look at VPN, and then we'll see how the next evolution of doing like remote access is like, and then why it makes sense. Right, so I think I'd like to start with how we got here as a history, right? So if you look at, if you think about app and users, right, back in the days, app and users normally sits in one location, right, in head office, near the data center, right? So they're in the same location where they belong to the same network, right? Then when you start having remote workforce, and this is especially apparent when COVID hits, right? People start working remotely. Right, so now you're gonna bring that user, because all your controls, all your security controls are on your data center or your perimeter, right? So to bring them back in, right? Most people use technology like VPN. That's been there for 20 years. Right? VPN is not new; it's been there forever, right? The concept of VPN is quite interesting, right? So we'll look into that in a while, right? And of course, you say, okay, if I bring that user in, I want to connect that user to my network, so that particular user can then access the app that they need to access in order to perform your duties, right? You also want to secure them, you install things like IPS, right? And then there's also, like now you're opening up an extra endpoint, you worry about if the endpoint gets attacked, your workforce will not be able to connect to your environment, right? So you have some DDoS defense and things like that. So you start building up all these layers of security, right, in your data center. Right, and then of course, this trend has been going for a while now. The apps are moving off net as well, right? So they either go to the, you can access app on the web itself, like GitHub, right? Or you can access things like, ServiceNow, that's like SaaS services, right? Salesforce, things like that. And of course, you have infrastructure as a service, things like Azure, GCP, AWS, right? And all those are, all those workload that you have traditionally in the data center starts to move out as well. And then of course, what do? You start, having this defense in that, right? You start putting things in like firewall, switch, secure web gateway, right? DLP, wow, you name it, right? Everything, right? You just put everything like layered, simply because now you want to try to bring the user and the workload, right, from that perspective into a single location where you can secure them, right? It's like hairpinning everything back in simply because you have a perimeter that's secure, right? Unfortunately with app and users out in the cloud, so let's say I'm here in Sydney, right? My data center is in, let's say, Perth for whatever reason, right? My connection will need to hairpin to Perth before it comes back to AWS in Sydney. Right, so imagine the user experience there, right? So that's where we think it's going to evolve. That's where Zscaler sits natively in the cloud, right? So I'll dive in a little bit into this, but let's look at VPN as well. What's VPN, right? Everyone knows VPN, right? But I've got these few pointers. I talked to a lot of customers, right? And these are the most common theme that I heard, right? VPN is used to connect user to network. Yes, you may have identity. Right, but if you boil it down beyond identity, it's really an IP-based control, so it's really a network-to-network connection, right? VPN's enforcement happens on and free. So what that means is, I'm trying to get in, something's going to challenge me, say, hey, prove who you are, right? So I'm going to say, well, I'm Johnny, it's my password, I may have MFA, I may have certificate on my device, whatever, right? I prove who I am. Once I prove who I am, I'm in. Right, so that's VPN, right? So that's typically how it works, right? I also hear that VPN is very permissive by default, right? You have an ACL that you apply, allow this thing from any to this network and this user to that network, right? So a lot of times it becomes a VLAN to VLAN kind of ACL, so it's very permissive. It's quite, once you get in, your blast radius is huge, right? That's the problem, right? And then you require to tackle that blast radius that's huge, like I just mentioned, right? You need to have more security stack. You need to deploy, like IPS, you need to deploy more stuff, right? and it creates complexity, and we all know complexity is not a good thing, right? Especially in Australia, where we have, problem with hiring people, right? That's the biggest problem, right? Hiring IT expertise is really hard. So a lot of times, if you look, this is a good example, right? If I did a lot of tender, a lot of times it's like 200 pages or 200 questions, let's say, right? And then when the rubber hits the road, that 200 things that they want, they roll up 10, 20, 30%, right? Whatever it is, right? It becomes a challenge, right? You have this thing that is so capable, but because it's so complex, you can't roll it out. It becomes a paperweight, right? And also, of course, there's also user experience impact, right? So when you look at user experience, that hair-pinning example that I gave you, right? Like in the industry, in the security industry, we always say there's always a tax when you apply security control, right? We call that performance tax, right? When you apply TLS encryption, TLS so-called inspection, there's a tax on the connection, right? There's a few millisecond tax, right? So that user experience gets impacted the more security layers you have, right? And then with VPN, it's also a low barrier of entry for adversaries, right? So if we look at the recent data breach, right? How many times do you hear about VPN in the recent data breach? Many times, right? If you look at the top 10 security breach out there globally, right? VPN, remote access, all this technology is always up there. I think it's in top 3, the last I checked, right? In 2022, right? All these are really common, right? So it's a really, if I'm an adversary, I want to penetrate some network, and I'm looking for low-hanging fruit, this is my first go-to, right? All I go to is MITRE attack, all the 0 days, then hit it, right? I'm going to have a really good day, right? Because the hit rate is going to be quite high. So if I kind of map this out from a security lens, right? So what is VPN, right? So when you connect a user to a network, right? Like when I go to my office, plug in my cable, right? My attack surface from the OSI perspective, right? OSI is a layer that all the IT people know, right? My attack surface is layer 1 to 7. So I've got this broad layer, right? So as users move out and goes into VPN, I remove that physical layer, but I still have a lot of layer, right? And because it's broad, it's going to be across all applications in the x-axis there, right? And that's the layer on the y-axis, right? With zero trust, right? Here's the challenge, right? The thinking is really to narrow down, right? To reduce the blast radius, right? To narrow down that attack surface, so when you connect to an application, you connect to the app, not to the network, right? So now effectively you reduce the blast radius to that single application and to that particular stack. And now you can build a defense around that stack rather than building a very broad defense around everything. So that's the whole idea, right? So how we do it, right? So if I'm going to go through this quickly. I think I have 20 minutes, so I'm already at 12 minutes. So we have this so-called cloud that we call Zero Trust Exchange. What it is really like a service broker, right? So the idea is you would throw everything at it, right? You would throw your users, your camera, the initiator at the bottom, your workload. It can be AWS. It doesn't matter. You throw everything at it, right? And then the destination, right? So it could be user heading up to SaaS or data center. Doesn't matter, right? It is agnostic, right? So the data center is also connected to that particular cloud. Right, so we will perform a few key functions, right? So at high level, the top, if I bracket it into 3, you want to verify, right? So you want to always verify, not just based on the username and password, you want to further verify that particular connectivity for every session. So that's the difference, right? For every session, right? So every session means I can have a session to my webmail, and I can have another session to Twitter. You want to verify these 2 sessions, right? You want to be able to control them differently, right? And also, you want to be able to enforce the right policy based on the initiator and the destination, right? Because if I go to Twitter, the policy could be different from if I go to my Office 365 to download data, right? So the first thing we do is who is connecting, right? So this is simple, like when you hit us, right, we can help you. If you use SAML or if you use, some IDP, Okta, Azure, AD, right? You can identify the user, you can authenticate that user. So before you let any connection through, you authenticate that user, right? And then you want to find out the context of that user, right? Is this user, let's say Johnny, is he using his corporate issued device, or is he using his iPhone, BYO, right? And you want to verify that because the policy can be different, right? And where is this connection going to, right? Is that user just going to the internet or to corporate application? Or if that's that camera down there, is it trying to go to GitHub? Or is it trying to go to some Dropbox somewhere, right? Does that make sense? So you want to kind of verify that. What is the context? Where are they going to? So that will give you that layered approach. So not just authenticate and you go, right? Authenticate and further constantly verify, right? The idea is really to assess the risk level, right? So for example, if I use my laptop and access the risk and access of a website that has malware, right? And it detonates in the, let's say, sandbox. Now my risk profile should be higher, right? Because I'm actually, maybe I click on a phishing link, right? So the risk profile could be higher. So the next time you see Johnny coming through again, you may want to say, hey, this user is a bit of a high-risk user, so let's be more conservative with his policy, right? So you can tune it that way. And also, you can prevent compromise, right? So the idea is really, because this is now, everything goes to it before, so between initiator and the destination, this the Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange, right? So now we can prevent compromise. A very good example is, like phishing is really common these days, right? Or sometimes you just go to a website, right? Supply chain attack is a big thing, right? If I cannot attack you directly, I'll attack your supply chain, right? And I hope that you click on that link, or I hope that you go to that website, right, and download the payload, right? If we can stop that payload, that's a good thing, right? So that will prevent that compromise, right? So I always say one thing, right? If you're not sure what to do, let's say you're not sure if I should allow user to this kind of, this website, I'm not sure if it's good or bad, right? But maybe you just put on a prompt, right? So a very basic control is telling the user, hey, the website you're visiting, right, could be malicious, right? What would user do? By default, user would cancel, right? So you don't even have to block, you just educate the user along the way. And that does two things, so you create a better behavior among your user, you stop the auto deployment of malware, right? So just by doing that very basic thing, just notify. 99% of the time, user will just cancel because potentially malicious. Oh no, I better not, right? Unless I go to a safe environment. And also data loss. This is the biggest topic today, right? Because of all the data breach these days, right? So what if the user or the device, right, tries to exfiltrate data to the cloud, right? Simple example is, let's say a user connects to Office 365, corporate tenancy, right? And then I want to connect to my private tenancy, and I start copying data from corporate tenancy and drop into my private tenancy. That's a risk, right? Because I cannot just say Azure in the allow listing, you can do whatever in Azure. You want to go beyond just identifying it's Azure, right? You want to go beyond just a label that says Azure.com, right? So you can prevent data loss, right? It's a big thing. So if you see license number getting out, things like that getting out, you may want to block, right? And also the initial context, like the access context, can give you further detail. Is this particular service hitting a production environment or a non-prod, right? So you can further control things like that. And of course, you then want to enforce the policy, right? So enforcement is not a simple 0 and 1, right? It can be a simple allow and deny if you want to, but most of the time we find that enforcement can be a lot more creative. You can say, allow the connection, but I want to make sure that it's secure. For example, right, if you have third party down there, the user and device, third party accessing a network, say, okay, I'll let third party in, because B2B, right, we have to let third party in, right? But I do not want the third party device or the BYO device to have a malware or a plugin on the browser that's actively listening and actively extracting data, right? So what you can do is you can say, I'm going to allow this connection, but because I don't trust a device, it could be BYO or third party, right? I'm going to fire up a isolated browser. So that means I'm going to stream down pixel, right? And I'm going to define policy that you cannot download payload or copy data, paste data, things like that. So you can now start to define policies like that, right, within the enforcement, right? So deny is a good thing, but sometimes you see a malware, like let's say a malware penetrate a network. You always assume, right, with zero trust, you always assume they are already inside. The malicious actor is already in your network, right? So if you see a malicious behavior, what you may want to do is redirect that user to a honeypot, right? Then you can do further investigation, see how widespread is this, right? So that's that's a few ways that you can do enforcement, right? And of course, it's always terminated, right? So the architecture for this platform is quite different. If I say crudely, we are like proxy architecture, right? There are a few types of two types of main architecture, right? There's a firewall architecture and there's a proxy architecture, right? Firewall does not break into the packet, right? Proxy terminates the connection, open up the TLS, and look at the payload, right? And that's why we can do all this scan. So that's the first thing, right? It's the network they're accessing from doesn't really matter. You can sit in the office, Starbucks, in the hotel today, hotspot, doesn't matter, right? The network I use to access my corporate services should be agnostic. It doesn't matter, right? And then on the other end of on the destination side, I could go to SaaS on the right, or I can go to on the left, sorry, or I can go to my private application on the right. Right, so if I go to like Facebook and stuff, it's like outbound, right? So I have different policy defined. But if I go to my corporate services, there's no need for a port and an IP to be open, to be exposed to the public. It's a dial-out architecture. So that data center over on the right, or IaaS, right, always dials out to the zero trust cloud. And the cloud will enforce all this control, and if you check all the boxes and it says allow, right, then it stitch the connection and establish that connection through. And this is done per session. The next time I open a different session to a different app, they do it all over again, right? So that's the difference. It's always enforcing for every connection. So if you have a MacBook, you type next step, right, you can see all your connection. Imagine it's doing this for every connection. And then, of course, the biggest thing here is user experience, right? You want to make sure that user experience are not impacted, right? So we give you, because now we have this end-to-end visibility of the connection, we're able to measure and help you be proactive when it comes to user experience, right? So, for example, a user could have really bad experience in, an isolated experience. When they log a case, you already know that it's probably the Wi-Fi that's causing a lot of latency, or it could be the CPU. So we monitor all those things. So why does this make sense? Right, there's a lot of reasons. I'm just going to quickly put it up here. Right, alignment principle, core security principles. Right, it reduces risk, so you eliminate a lot of risk as you go into this architecture. You become a lot more agile, so there's no need to set up network. When you set up a new office, let's say I'm going to open up Perth or South Australia or Adelaide as a new office, right? I can just say, all right, just get an NBN and off you go, right? It's a satellite office, right? There's no more let's put firewalls, swing out there, not happening, right? And you also learn from the past, right? So you want to disconnect from the network. You don't want to depend on that network, right? Because it's a lot to think about, right? So for Zscaler, I work in the Melbourne office, I work in a service office. We just hop into the service office network, right? For me, I always hop into my hotspot because I just don't trust anything, right? Right, but you can have users hopping into a hotspot, it doesn't matter, it's agnostic, they are secure, right, by default, right, because they're hitting the cloud to start with, right? And then of course, you can start building this champion, have your users create a more secure environment. Right, so I'm going to end with this slide here. Right, so this is a new way of thinking. It's not going to be overnight. I agree, right? Because we are so used to creating ways around, creating access around network, right? So this change, there's always steps, right? So we can help you kind of define what are the lowest barrier of entry and how do you get to your ideal state, right? So a lot of our customers actually go through that journey. It's a journey, right? Zero Trust is a strategy. It's not a product. It's a strategy. Right, so we help you define a strategy and how we can adopt this, and maybe depending on your risk appetite, you can have different timelines. Right, so thank you for your time, and if you want to get in touch, I'll be back there, or you can scan this QR. Right, you'll be on my LinkedIn. Thank you.